A black judge is wrongfully arrested by a white cop, only to face him in court the next morning as the presiding judge. What happens next sends shockwaves through the city, sparking outrage and a reckoning. The events that follow will leave you speechless. But let's start at the beginning. Officer Daniel Miller, a seasoned 34-year-old veteran of the Maplewood Police Force, was known for his no-nonsense demeanor. On a brisk Friday evening, he cruised through the quiet, dimly lit streets of the suburban town, his sharp eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. To many, Daniel was a dedicated enforcer of the law, but others whispered about his heavy-handed approach, especially toward the town's minority residents. That night, Daniel's attention was drawn to a sleek black sedan parked near a corner store. The driver, a sharply dressed black man in his early 40s, paced the sidewalk, occasionally glancing at his phone. The man's confident posture and expensive attire might have suggested professionalism, but to Daniel, the scene appeared suspicious. He parked his cruiser nearby and stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on his utility belt. "Evening," Daniel called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What are you doing out here this late?" The man, Marcus Wright, looked up with a measured expression, his eyebrows slightly raised. "Waiting for a friend. Is that a problem, officer?" His tone was calm, but his words carried an undercurrent of quiet defiance. Daniel wasn't convinced. "I'll need to see some ID," he said, his tone firm. Marcus complied without hesitation, handing over his identification. As Daniel scrutinized the ID, tension thickened in the air. "Your actions seem out of place," Daniel said, pressing further. Marcus remained composed, but firm. "Standing outside isn't a crime. I know my rights." Daniel's demeanor shifted. His defensiveness turned into irritation, and the exchange grew heated. Accusations flew, voices rose, and the situation quickly spiraled. In a moment of misplaced authority, Daniel announced Marcus was under arrest for disorderly conduct. At the precinct, Marcus maintained an unshakable dignity, even as Daniel tried to provoke him with pointed remarks. Locking the cell, Daniel muttered, "Let's see how far that attitude gets you." Unbeknownst to Daniel, this ordinary arrest would soon shatter the boundaries of his carefully controlled world. The next morning, Officer Daniel Miller walked into the courthouse with unwavering confidence. He had spent the evening preparing for what he expected to be a straightforward case. The charges against Marcus Wright, in his mind, were solid. As he entered the grand chamber, murmurs rippled through the courtroom, the air thick with anticipation. Daniel barely noticed, brushing past the crowd and taking his seat near the front. The moment the judge entered, Daniel's world tilted. There, in a black robe that seemed to command the room, stood Marcus Wright. The man he had arrested less than 24 hours ago now presided over the case. Marcus's gaze locked onto Daniel with calm intensity, his authority radiating from every word and movement. "Officer Miller," Marcus began, his voice measured but with an unmistakable edge. "It seems we've met under unusual circumstances." His tone was professional, but the undercurrent of righteous anger was impossible to ignore. But today, justice will prevail. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence, the tension palpable. Daniel's composure faltered, his jaw tightening as the hearing commenced. Marcus, unshaken and meticulously prepared, presented an ironclad defense. Surveillance footage from the corner store played on a screen, showing Marcus calmly pacing and checking his phone. No sign of disorderly conduct. Witnesses testified, recalling how Marcus had handled the situation with quiet dignity, despite the escalating confrontation initiated by Daniel. Daniel squirmed in his seat as his case unraveled. Every point he had prepared was dismantled with precision by Marcus, who wielded the law like a scalpel, exposing the baselessness of the charges. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Marcus rose from his seat. His voice, steady and powerful, carried across the room. This was not just an arrest. It was a reflection of systemic bias and the abuse of authority. His declaration sent a ripple through the crowd, the weight of his words striking deep. The charges were dismissed, but the real impact was on Daniel. As he left the courtroom, visibly shaken, Marcus's steely resolve lingered in his mind. Justice had prevailed, but for Daniel, it was just the beginning of a reckoning he could no longer avoid. News of the dramatic courtroom confrontation spread like wildfire, fueling outrage across the community. Headlines called attention to the incident, framing it as a stark example of systemic injustice. Outside the police precinct, crowds of protesters gathered with signs demanding accountability for Officer Daniel Miller's actions. Chants of "Justice for Marcus" and "End racial profiling" echoed through the streets, while social media exploded with calls for reform. Marcus Wright, no longer just a judge but now a voice for change, took the opportunity to address the broader issues of racial profiling and institutional bias. In interviews and public statements, he spoke about the deeper roots of inequality, urging the city to confront uncomfortable truths. His words resonated, sparking debates in homes, offices, and town halls. Change seemed possible, but resistance loomed. For Daniel, the fallout was deeply personal. His actions were scrutinized, not just by the public, but also by his peers within the department. Once a figure of respect among his colleagues, he now felt the weight of disapproval. Shame gnawed at him, but so did defiance. He grappled with conflicting emotions, resentment at being vilified, and an uneasy acknowledgement that he might have been wrong. In quieter moments, Daniel began to question the values he once believed defined him as an officer of the law. One evening, unable to bear the internal conflict, Daniel drove to the courthouse. He waited outside, his stomach churning with nerves. As Marcus emerged, his robes exchanged for a tailored suit, Daniel approached him with visible hesitation. "Judge Wright, I'd like to talk," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Marcus stopped, his sharp eyes studying Daniel. After a long pause, he nodded and gestured to a nearby bench. They sat in silence for a moment before Daniel began, his words halting. "I didn't see you as a person that night. I was wrong. I've been wrong about a lot of things." Marcus listened, his expression unreadable. When Daniel finished, Marcus spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, but words alone won't change a broken system." The conversation ended, but for Daniel, it marked the beginning of a long journey toward understanding and redemption. Moved by their conversation, Daniel resolved to take action. He enrolled in sensitivity training and joined community outreach programs, seeking to bridge the divide between law enforcement and marginalized groups. Over time, his efforts earned him cautious respect from the community. Meanwhile, Marcus spearheaded a reform initiative, partnering with local leaders to implement mandatory bias training for officers and establish civilian oversight committees. He often invited Daniel to speak at these events, showcasing his transformation as a testament to the power of accountability. Months later, at a town hall meeting, Daniel took the stage alongside Marcus. Facing the crowd, he shared his story, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned, and the hope he now carried for a more equitable future. As the meeting concluded, Daniel extended his hand to Marcus. "Thank you," he said earnestly, "for holding me accountable and for showing me a better way." Marcus shook his hand, his stern demeanor softening into a faint smile. "It's not about me," he replied. "It's about building a system where justice isn't a privilege but a right for all." The applause that followed echoed with the promise of change.